Sometimes I write books just to learn about something I don't know enough about. And I wanted to learn more about the Depression. First of all, I don't think it really registered with me how long it lasted. And that it came in waves that things would be horrible, and then they'd get a little better, a little better, a little better. People would think, oh, it's over with. And then it would go into a trough again for years and years. So I wanted to learn about that and find some stories to tell about it. And I'd always been interested in the WPA, all of that public art. It wasn't all WPA. There was the Treasury Department section for public art and others. And just that notion that public art was important, and that it could help shape people's vision, understanding of the place they live, and make them proud of it.
Did you grow up, when I read the novel, the mural that's in the post office, I immediately thought about the post office in Devon where I grew up and thinking, oh yeah, like something that's sort of, you don't notice it because you see it every day going to the post office. Did you grow up in a town that had any of these footprints of that public work?
No.
Oh wow, okay.
Some of you, given we're not that far away from it, I grew up in a little town called Andrews in Cherokee County, and our post office was just kind of like in a storefront on Main Street. Like Boone, North Carolina has a really good one. It's Daniel Boone crossing Cumberland Gap kind of thing. I've always loved looking at them, and I noticed them when I've gone to the post offices. In Chapel Hill, when I was in school down there, they had two huge public art murals that were really good ones. So yeah, they've always been something I paid attention to.
It made me, we don't use that post office closed, but it made me kind of wish I could go back and appreciate it in a way that I hadn't before.
Do you know what happened to the mural?
I don't know. I can find out, though. I mean, I won't text my mom right now and ask her. I'm sure she'd be glad to tell me.
Well, a lot of those were done not on the wall like Val was doing in this book, but were done on canvas. And in a lot of cases, the painters didn't, if it was in a remote place like Wyoming, they would just paint it on canvas and to a dimension, and then it would just get glued to the wall. And sometimes those they've been able to get them off the wall and maybe put them in the library, the town library.
I'm going to find out. Speaking of Val, I was really drawn to the narrative voice. And you have I think one of the things you've done across all of your works are your narrators are very strong. So you have the third person narrator in Cold Mountain. And I will remind everyone in the audience, as I do my students, that the author is not the same as the narrator. Sometimes we forget. But then we have Will Cooper in 13 Moons, who is dubiously reliable, I will say. That might be generous to him. So with Val bringing his own kind of perspective and baggage to the text as this New Deal sponsored muralist who gets swept up in way more than he bargained for, how do you go about finding the right narrative voice for the story you're trying to tell?
It takes a while. I never know when I go, is this going to be third person or first person? I always tell myself it's going to be first person because I remember the thing that Norman Mailer said when he had a really, really tight deadline on the book. And he said, if you're really under the gun, first person is your friend. And it was true. It's easier in some ways. So I think every book I've done, I've started out trying both voices, and I'll work for maybe as much as 6 months, write some sections in first, some in third, try different kinds of different variations of limited third, a little less limited third, that kind of thing. It's not a thing I ever make a conscious decision on. I start feeling comfortable with one voice or another for the book and just stick with it.
And how did Val win that contest in the writing of this book?
I had to understand the character better, and that he's somebody who he wants to act like a tough guy in a 30s film noir. He wants to think he's cynical, and he's not. He's kind of a good kid. He grew up in a upper middle class family in Norfolk, Virginia. He hasn't suffered greatly from the Depression, and he's at heart optimistic and a little naive, and that little naive really comes to play in his relationship with Eve, really the main character of the book.
And so even though the narrator is not the author, as I just warned, I'm going to ask a question that makes it sound like I already forgot. In the novel, Val offers really beautiful and compelling thoughts about painting a mural, about layering color and shape and all the base layers you have to do. And at times I started to wonder if there was a metaphor for how you think about building a story. And I wondered if you could talk about that language of painting and color that you use in the novel and how you see it maybe related to your own creative process.
Yeah, I'm sure a lot of Val's thoughts about painting a mural, which has a certain narrative element to it, is very much related to the way I put the novel together. The layering, the rethinking, revising, that kind of thing. Sometimes people ask me, how many drafts did you write this book? And I never know how to answer that because I don't really work in drafts. I just write, and then I get some new ideas about the book, and I write some more of that, and then I go back and change what I've already written to match it. And it's just this constant, a lot of times it feels like 2 steps forward, 1 step forward, 2 steps back. I had an editor once, and she said this, and she did not mean it in any way to be a compliment. She said, I've never worked with a writer whose process is as intuitive as yours is. How else would you do it?
That's the problem with intuition, isn't it? And also, I really appreciate how the sections of the book have color grounding, and I spent a lot of time trying to figure out how it moves from the blue to the cinnabar, like all the sections, and then the last one is indelible black, I think.
Because he makes a little tiny last revision using a fountain pen.
Yeah, and I was just curious about how you, just the language of color is so beautiful in those sections and how they ground them. Were there particular parts that you were most drawn to when you were in it with the language driving you of color that you felt like, I've got something here?
Usually I waited till I had the chapter fairly well written and then tried to decide what color. So I think what's the one for the sky early on, cinnabar blue?
Or cinnabar for the bridge and azure.
It was because there's a scene in there where he's up on the scaffolding painting this mural, and a man and his little daughter come in, and she's fascinated with what he's doing, and just kind of shoots up the ladder, and all of a sudden she's standing beside him on the scaffolding. And he gives her a paintbrush and has her paint. So I thought, okay, I'll use the color he was painting for that, and just kind of each one had something to do with something that happened, but I would do them after I had the chapter.
Oh, that's good. Yeah, I wondered which came first.
Like in Cold Mountain, I use for chapter titles little phrases, little bits, not a full sentence, just a few words from the chapter. And with that, I just made a rule. You can't write a title you want to use and then make it work. You've got to write the chapter and then find the title in the chapter. It's just kind of sort of a little game I was playing with myself.
That makes sense. So I've heard it said that writers are sometimes advised to cut the travel time.
Yeah.
You know, that it's maybe not the most effective for plot. But something I really enjoyed about the trackers is how much travel time is in the novel. It's largely travel time, and Val is thrown into situations and conversations that really do ground the book. And so 2 questions from that. One, how did you make the choice to lean in to the travel time as a setting in and of itself? And then maybe from there, to what extent do Val's adventures mirror your own experiences? See, I know narrator is not the author. But how much do Val's experiences mirror the whirlwind you were thrown into with travel and promotion for wildly successful books? I just wondered if there were some echoes or tidbits of your own planes, trains, and automobiles.
Well, I always loved to travel. My dad was he was a school superintendent, and back then they had lots of time in the summer. I think it's different now. So we'd go on these long vacations, and we'd load up the station wagon and go west and be gone for weeks. And I love that. I love those places. In the West, I love to travel. My mother hated to travel. But I like writing about travel. The first book I ever wrote that you could actually go in a bookstore and buy was a travel book. It had the very clunky title, Adventuring in the Andes, but that was a series title for Sierra Club books. That was a book about trekking and mountaineering in the northern Andes. So I love that, and I liked the idea of Val having a chance to see different places, for this Norfolk kid who didn't know the world all that well, for him to see how the Depression is affecting a lot of different parts of the country. So he starts out on a train across the Great Plains, seeing these little towns and being really struck by that. And then he gets to see a lot of things. That Hooverville in Seattle was one of the really big ones in the country. And I really enjoyed that research, finding out what a big homeless encampment, which became almost like a weird kind of neighborhood.
And that's one of the moments. Doesn't he meet 2 people that are papering their housing quarters with books for insulation?
They built this little shack out of scraps and tar paper and scrap roofing material. And they found all these rich people were getting rid of their stuff and finding that they can get books just by taking a wheelbarrow and loading them up. And they're using them to insulate the wall, but they also have their own little library. So they talk a little bit about Oh yeah, I read Parkman's Oregon Trail. I did this. So they can just, as one of the characters says, you know, you're sitting here on a cold rainy day in Seattle, and you just pull out a piece of wall and start with it.
Did you, Val's Adventures in Florida,
Yeah.
with several different cab drivers,
Yeah.
he gets a little bit road weary. And is that something that you, definitely probably not to the extreme he finds himself in, but did you find over the years sometimes just the constant conversation that you have as you move around, did you draw from those experiences?
That section, the Florida section, is supposed to be kind of horrific and kind of funny. And,
It is, yeah, you hit it.
And he ends way up in the country, and it was that was drawn from an area in Central Florida where I used to do a lot of mountain bike riding, and it was just this. It was along the Withlacoochee River, and it would be muddy one minute and sandy the next minute, and alligators in the river, and alligators flopped over on the trail sometimes, and there's a scene where he sees a snake that's just eating something really big, lumbering down the center of the road. That was drawn from personal experience. So I wanted to get him all the way diagonally across the country from Seattle. And then he had to get there, and he takes a really, really horrible plane ride, because commercial air travel in the 30s was horrible. And he gets down there and he meets weird people and feels threatened, and he gets beat up, and there's just all kinds of things happen to him. And I just wanted him to experience a whole kind of people, kind of world that, as the son of a lawyer in Norfolk, he didn't know existed.
No, I mean, in most of the novel, I keep thinking like he's a painter, you know? He's not prepared for anything that's about to happen.
Yeah, he gets without spoilers. I think this is on the book jacket. His benefactor in Wyoming sends him out on a mission that's sort of like being a private detective. And he finds it interesting to the idea of it, he likes, and then he gets into the reality of it. So it's not what he was hoping for, but yeah, he's out doing something he has no experience, no aptitude for, trying to find a missing person.
I feel bad. I mean, he's not real, but I feel bad. He has no aptitude for it. I think he does it, but yeah, he really does it. Yeah.
He's persistent. You can at least say that.
No, he is dogged in trying to find his aptitude. There was a moment in the novel. I maybe shared this with you earlier, but when you go on an academic job talk or search or you're interviewed, you give what's called a job talk, and it's a presentation of your work. And I actually gave my job talk at Georgia State on 13 Moons, so I probably do owe you my job. We'll have to work out later what those royalties are. There's a job talk about. But it's probably your novel I really know the best. I actually read 13 Moons before I read Cold Mountain. There's a passage in the trackers that is about these places where the maps can't guide us. And it's so similar to a passage in 13 Moons when Will Cooper is first going into Cherokee territory and the map cuts off, and I think he says something like, all that means is you've reached the limit of the map is knowing. And then Cold Mountain, one of the earlier editions, I think, has a map. I don't know if it's still printed. It's a map that opens the book. And so I wanted to ask you about how you seem to be continually drawn to maps, but also unmapped space. And these spaces where your characters and narrators, either the maps are pushing them, or they're kind of somewhere where the maps fail them. And so I'm curious about you return to this theme a lot and how you think about it, and also, do maps compose a part of your writing process?
Yeah, for sure. I love looking at maps. I used to do an awful lot of backpacking back in the day before smartphones and all that, before any of that way of accessing that information came along. So it was paper maps. And somebody told me, just as an example of how a USGS topo map, that you can train yourself to see all those little fine lines, to see that in 3D. And I could sometimes do that. The white on the map, I really loved finding a really old map of western North Carolina from the time of 13 Moons. And you got west of Waynesville, and it was just white and said Indian Territory. In South America, I remember going to the equivalent of the Pentagon in Lima, Peru, to buy maps. And you had to go past these like 15-year-olds with submachine guns and got maps. And once you got like past very far at all, really outside of a good-sized city, there would be just big stretches of white on those maps. And there was always something just kind of romantic about the notion that there are still unmapped places, or were. So that just that image of a map with a blank spot on it, I've always loved.
Well, and I think it's kind of indicative. It seems like a lot of your characters have, and I think this is especially true in the trackers, they have a sense of what they're supposed to be able to do. Like if I just follow these things, this will be the outcome. I think Eve's husband, John, that's so indicative of how he's approaching, his whole life. And it kind of seems like maybe the emotional maps fail people sometimes in your work.
I hadn't thought of it that way. That sense of what I'm supposed to do and what I will get out of that by doing it right. Fails.
Yeah, and when you were thinking about choosing Wyoming, if you look at a map of Wyoming, I've only ever driven across 80, which just leaves 90% of the state. This space that I presume someone wants to go there. I don't want to say. I chose not to. But you talk about just these concentrations of the capital's too close to Denver and all of this detail about Wyoming. What brought you to kind of wanting to think about that space that is similar but so very different from Western North Carolina?
Yeah. Well, we go out there a lot. The first time I remember going out through Wyoming, I was probably maybe 12 at the most. And you've got Western North Carolina is such a temperate rainforest. And then you get out to Kansas and it's wheat fields and everything's brown, and get out to the Rockies and they're rocky and blue, not green. But some of my father's love of that part of the country rubbed off on me from those trips. Even after I wasn't going on family vacations anymore, there were years when I was in college and graduate school, that it just felt like a summer. What are you supposed to do in the summer? You load up the car and you drive to Wyoming or Colorado or somewhere out there, spend time. So I would, like work a part-time job in college and save money to be able to do that for the summer. I really like the idea of being a chance to write about that landscape as opposed to the temperate rainforest of western North Carolina.
And you lived in Colorado
Yeah.
for some time. Did you draw from that time?
Yeah.
Yeah.
I was teaching at University of Colorado, and my wife was too. And at a university job, you can kind of have a little different schedule. So there was one winter I skied, I think 38 days. And then when spring would come, I'd put away the skis and get out the bike and ride 2,500 miles over the course of the summer. So all of that landscape, I had plenty of opportunity to soak it in.
It comes across. Having only been there once and feeling like an expert, I read the book and I was like, this guy knows Wyoming. I mean, I don't know anything about Wyoming, but you sold, having driven across it just once, will not do it again. But it felt like I remembered. I mean, the way Val seeing it felt really reminiscent of how the first time I saw it.
And part of why I wanted Val as the voice is that he's seeing it for the first time, and everything looks new to him.
Yeah, it does. And I mean, if he's coming from the East Coast, it's just so like landing on Mars, essentially. So this has been written, others have noted in talking about the trackers, it's a novel he wrote primarily during the early years of the pandemic.
Yeah.
And people have talked about a lot of its political resonances to the present day. How, in writing this book, how do you think composing under those conditions of 2020, 2021, how do you feel like it affected the plot and theme and the structure of the book?
Well, one way was that in the research, and with research on a book, I don't do a huge chunk at the beginning and then that's it. I'm doing it constantly. And I kept being surprised in reading about the politics of the Depression era, of international politics, that kind of stuff, and just individual incidents in history. I wasn't looking for it, but I kept finding all of these parallels. And I thought, well, I'm just going to put those in, and I'm not going to comment on them, I'm not going to particularly call attention to it. It's just what's happening while the book was going on. Sometimes it was, just kind of, you stumble upon it on Val's way out on the train. He's stopping at train stations and picking up a newspaper and all that. And one morning, and it's the morning that it would have been, the Hindenburg explosion, whatever disaster happened. He walks in and sees all the newspapers opened up in the dining car with those horrific photographs of the Hindenburg on fire. I do when I'm writing, I have a calendar, and I can look. I don't know. This is just for me, but I can look at a calendar and say, I know when Val took that fictional train trip. Now you look at the newspapers and see what happened, and it can give you details to help kind of flesh out this world you're trying to build. And I just like the correspondence of it being actually the fictional calendar and the real calendar meshing together as perfectly as I can make it.
I like that. It's like a time map in a little bit, right? It's the same kind of, you're thinking, the way you think spatially also sounds a lot like how you think about temporally where this is going to line up. And there's a moment where he also sees the headline about Earhart missing in 37, which is, that happens at the same moment in North Carolina that they start the Lost Colony outdoor performance, which is a public works project. And so it really, when I was reading, I know you had said in one of our conversations you put a lot of your Steinbeck away to not be overly influenced, but it felt so reminiscent of that. Kind of just really, when we think of some of these really Great Depression stories, it had that ring of truth in it. And what do you, what's your process, and what do you read while you're writing or not read while you're writing, or how do you put your work or in conversation, or do you set that aside as you're writing? Does this question make sense? Like, what am I trying to ask? I'm trying to ask, what is your kind of guide as you're in your reading life, either creative in addition to the history as you're writing, or how do you use that process differently? Do you not read while you're working on something?
Well, I don't read like contemporary fiction. When I'm working on a book, I don't want to be influenced, or I don't want to read something and think, God, that's so good. My book stinks, so I try not to do that. I'm trying to read. I read novels from the time, along with the nonfiction stuff like this book. A book that was really helpful. It shaped the book. It helped create the character of Eve. The book would be a very different book without it. It's got the somewhat unfortunate title. It was written in the early 30s. It's called Boy and Girl Tramps of America. And this graduate student, I think maybe at the University of Chicago, looked young enough to hang out, to go out and pretend like he was a homeless person going from place to place trying to find jobs with teenagers. And it was so full of stories and details, how these kids got by. There are estimates that there were somewhere in the neighborhood of 500,000 homeless teenagers and kids as young as 12 out on the roads looking for work during the worst of the Depression. And I wanted this character Eve to have been one of those kids. That book was really influential. It was totally out of print. I just got lucky in finding a copy, and it's been reprinted by University of Nebraska Press, I think it is. Now, so it's available again.
With Eve as one of the central characters, a lot of the book really seems to pose this question that some characters just cannot understand other characters' perspective or motivations. And essentially the three men in the book do not understand Eve. And there is, and I don't know that she understands them either, to be fair. Maybe, I think she has a better read on them than they do on her. But the book kind of subverts like a damsel in distress narrative where they all think they're helping Eve, but she has this whole world of experience from having lived on the road and been young. They can't quite get there. And I was wondering how you thought about setting up characters who just don't understand one another, or you clearly know the other character's motivation, but then how do you keep those characters, how do you show that they really are not getting it?
Yeah, like Eve she's been a teenage hobo in the worst of the Depression and survived. She lucks into a job singing in a cowboy dance band that goes around the Grange halls and that kind of thing in little western towns and plays at dances for cowboys. And then this rich guy sees her and just falls instantly in love, and they get married. So she's gone from having to leave home because her family can't afford for her to stay, to being married to one of the wealthiest men in the state. And Val thinks she's great, and her husband's in love with her and all that. But they never understand it. They always, Val especially, is always about 2 beats behind her. Whatever she's talking about or whatever she does, he's never, he has to be beat over the head with it to get it. He's a fairly naive guy. John just is so arrogant.
He doesn't care. Yeah, he doesn't understand and doesn't care to understand. It's even with the family in Florida. I think the wife character in Florida, I don't know that the men in the house really understand her either. She seems to be a little bit more in control than at first blush you might realize.
And she's got this, I tried to write her with this somewhat dreamy kind of personality. It just feels like she has this little bit of a gauze layer between her and reality all the time.
It's the humidity. So when you set up your characters, and I would like to, I think around this time, just if you haven't already written your questions from the audience, I can't see my signals. If anyone's giving me one, I apologize. But if you haven't already done so, please make sure that you pass your cards for questions from the audience. But which of the characters surprised you most with what they did? Because I've read before that, you kind of like to set up your characters in the time and place and see what they're going to do. Did any of these characters surprise you as you were working?
Well, they probably all do in some way or another, but I think one of the ones that surprised me, and I can't, without it being spoilers, say too much about it, but there's an old cowboy who's one of the main characters in this book, and he's got a lot of 19th century America in it. People have rumors about him. Oh, he was the young soldier who bayoneted Crazy Horse and killed him. He was in the Lincoln County War in Nebraska, and he was hanging around with Billy the Kid, and he helped Billy the Kid escape Pat Garrett. And he generally won't comment on those rumors. But he does say that, well, maybe there might be a little something to that Billy the Kid. But the way he negotiates, he's the foreman on this big ranch that the rich guy has. The way he negotiates dealing with all 3 of the other characters would sometimes surprise me. By surprising, I'd be writing along, I'd be thinking, so what's Pharaoh going to do here? What's his reaction going to be? And then the thing that would pop into my mind would not be what I was expecting it to be. Oh yeah, that's what we would do.
He's really one of my favorite characters in the book. Did you write a lot of backstory for him? And like, do you have a backstory that you set up for a lot of characters that doesn't make it in?
Yeah. Oh gosh, I had, golly, I'm suddenly recalling how much I have. How much time I spend working on this stuff. It's in a file right now. I wrote a whole backstory about stuff when he was young and growing up. How his family moved west when he was really young. And all him being in the army. He does get to tell a story about being in the cavalry, or not being in it, but being kind of like a subcontractor with the army. I was doing a thing like this one time, and somebody in the audience said, somebody said that there are two kinds of writers. There are taker-outers and putter-inners. And you strike me as a putter-inner. And I just said, would it surprise you to know that I have probably 250 pages that I cut from Cold Mountain? I said, just throw it away. He said, did you tell me where you threw it?
When you have a character based like Will Cooper, I mean, I know it does say in the author's note, Will Cooper is not William Holland Thomas, but, I mean, he is though, right? He is not, right? What do you, how do you work with that historical character or Marina? How do you shape your character next to that historical archive character?
I usually try to make rules that the facts of history are the facts of history, and whatever I write needs to. The kind of historical fiction I don't like is the kind where it's exactly what happened, and you just get more detail about how the characters are dressed or something like that. I want to make a character that experiences those things and has reactions to it, has feelings about all of that may not be, we don't know what Verena Davis thought about, but I want to write about a character who experiences what she did. So there's the stuff that I can't fool with, and then there's the stuff that I'll allow myself to fool with and build stories around.
And what about the parts where we really don't know? In 13 Moons, we don't know how Solly died. We don't know. Yeah. Like, there are things, there are just so many versions. How do you guide what narrative choice you make in those moments? When there's a plethora of versions of what happened.
The scene where Solly dies, I went to the place, just spent time thinking about, if you get this many people with the job of executing a man and some of his family members, how would they move in this space? It's by the river, there's a pretty big flat area on the side of the river. It helps me just sort of block out where things would happen, how people would live, how they would act, and then fit my understanding of the character around the things that are verifiable, facts about that historic moment. But as you said, there's not a lot of historical detail that. With the capture of Solly, I went to a place in that vicinity where he and his family were captured, and just found the spot wasn't the spot where it happened, but found a spot close to where it happened, and just sat there and just walked around, sat, thought, walked around. How would they, they camped there a few days, how would they have camped in this spot? I like to get for myself, get those kinds of details as specific as I can make them.
That's interesting. Yeah, and I think being in this space, it is one of those stories, the version of it you're going to tell kind of says more about where you are in that moment of your own telling than it does about what actually happened, right?
Yeah. Historical fiction is an interesting genre to me because there's so many different ways to do it. And there are a lot of those ways that I don't particularly like to read. And the historic fiction that I really like tends to me to focus on the feel of that historic moment, some kind of resonance that moment has that's beyond fact. So I'm always looking for that historic resonance.
We're going to turn to some questions from the audience. So, which one of your books has been the most rewarding personally for you? If you have, I feel like this is asking you to choose among children or something. But which one has? Which one do you feel drawn back to or had a special moment?
That really is a hard question. I never go back and reread my work. Once it's published, I've never reread Cold Mountain, I've never reread any of them. Because I know I'd be wanting to. Oh, that makes sense. I like to do that. I don't know. In some ways, Night Woods is kind of closest to my heart. That one is the closest to the little town I grew up in, and I have more emotional connection to that, I think.
And it's set in the 1960s.
Yeah.
So you're, I don't want to age you, but...
If you remember the 60s, you won't really think. Somebody asked me, did I consider that historic fiction? I said, no. To me, historic fiction, if you remember it, if you live were alive at that time and remember it, then that is not historical fiction. If you were born in 1978, it is.
It's good to know where my line is. And it's also, Night Woods has a detective feel, like it has that kind of feel and movement to it.
It's got I wanted it to have a little bit of a country noir kind of feel.
When you see elements, I think, of that in the trackers, it's not, I wondered when I started, was it going to be similar to Nightwood because of the blur, but it takes, Val thinks he's in Nightwoods, I think, but the joke is he's not. But he, like you said, he imagines he's in this great noir tableau that we can kind of see that he isn't, but it's sweet that he is. Here's a question. You've probably had this before, and how did you feel about the film of Cold Mountain?
Well, there were a lot of things I wish had been done differently, and Anthony Minghella and I argued about so many of them. I had so much access to him during the development of that movie. I was on a discussion panel with several other writers one time who had their novels adapted for movies. And they all, I was kind of the last one to talk, and they all had stories that were just horrible. Oh, they paid no attention to me. They basically just told me to go away and leave them alone. They were going to do what they were going to do. It was just that kind of thing. And then it came my turn to talk, and I was like, they treated me so well. It was not a fun thing to talk about because it was nice. Anthony was a really great guy, and he listened. He sent me every draft of the screenplay. He'd come to Asheville, and we'd sit on the porch of the Grove Park Inn and argue about who would make a good Edmund and who'd make a good Ada. We met in London, we met in Rome, and just talked about it. And he didn't get upset. I said, I really don't like that idea. So I had all that access. I wish the movie had a smaller budget. I think it would have been, to me, a better movie if it didn't have such a big budget. But one thing, being around it a lot, is understanding. I came away from it thinking, anytime a big Hollywood movie that a sensible grown-up can watch and not feel bad about having seen is kind of a miracle. Like with that, I can sit at home, wearing sweatpants and a t-shirt and do what I do. Anthony has to go get somebody had to go find somebody to give him tens of millions, virtually $100 million in that time's money to do it. So I think there were so many things I would have done differently, but the book's mine, the movie's his, and I was sympathetic with what he went through to get that movie made.
For Verena, how did you come to the choice to write about Jefferson Davis's wife? What led to that decision?
I just ran across a little short story, just a little incident in her life that got me interested. And then I found out that her little boys, she got criticized in the papers in Richmond for letting her children run loose in town. And they were in these little kids' gangs. They got essentially arrested one time for something they were doing. But they brought home to the Confederate White House a little black boy their age who was sort of an orphan. And he just moved into the nursery in the Confederate president's house. And when Richmond was about to be taken, they left, Verena and the kids left a few days before that, and that little boy went with them. He stayed with them all the way to when they got captured in South Georgia. I went to the very spot where they were camped that night as part of my research. Taken away from him, and he quickly disappears from history. And I became really interested in that character and her relationship with that character. And so I wrote a book. The structure of the book is that boy has grown up, and he realizes that she's staying at a resort hotel in upstate New York near where he is. And he goes to see her and talk to her and ask questions. And he wants to know things like, some of the newspapers called me your pet. Is that the way you saw me? And so every Sunday he comes up to Saratoga, and they sit at this resort hotel and talk. And the more they do that, the more aggressive he gets in asking her questions, and the more he pushes her to really tell the truth. My wife got obsessed with that little boy, and she has maybe found out what happened to him that hasn't been published yet. Anyway, it was that relationship. There's a really great picture of the Jefferson children and that little boy that they called Jimmy Limber because he was really limber and could do all these weird things with his fingers. And there's a picture of them with their children made by a professional photographer in the nursery there in the house. So the book is that back and forth, and that boy as a grown man trying to understand that part of his life that he doesn't fully remember.
And she also had a history of substance abuse kind of imposed on her as well, or it's unclear.
Well, she kind of liked Robin.
Yeah. And does that affect the way you think her voice sounds in her narrative voice of the work?
I probably was trying to get some of that in. I mean, she had children die young, all that when Jefferson Davis was a senator, a U.S. senator in Washington, and she was sort of in Washington society at the time. And there were, I did a whole bunch of research on London, and she was good friends with Mary Chestnut, who wrote that wonderful diary of the Civil War. And Mary Chestnut was just totally wide open about, oh God, I take London all the time. I pretty much have to.
Yeah, I mean, she says in that very clearly, like, you couldn't get through a day of any of this.
Yeah.
Here's a question about your process and craft. Do you have, what's your daily writing routine? Is it daily? Do you work towards trying to have so many pages or so many minutes? How is your process for composition and filling out a project?
Yeah, it works better for me if it's daily, even if I don't get anything done. Because there are a lot of days where I just wake up feeling like I'm not going to get anything done today. But you never know till you sit down. And it's one of the things I always tell young writers is do not wait for inspiration. If I waited for inspiration, I would never have written a book. You just give yourself some time. Whatever works for you. It could be an hour, it could be 2 hours, 3 hours, to sit there at the desk and just think about it, look at what you've already done, read something related to it, and then sometimes my best days of work are the days that I thought were going to be pointless. But inspiration is not a motivator.
I think Twain said it exists, but it must find you working.
I don't remember that quote from Twain. Yes, exactly.
If it hits and you're not at the desk,
Yeah.
who knows where it goes.
Thomas McGuane, if any of you have read his stuff, he says that the way he works is he goes to his office every day, and the rule is he just has to sit at the desk, and he doesn't have to write, but he can't do anything else.
What do you something you wish you knew? What would you tell yourself who started Cold Mountain? Is there something you would do differently, or wish you knew when you started out with the process?
I think to quit telling myself I should be doing a different process, that I should write faster, that I should be more efficient with research, that kind of thing. That I would love to be able to write, to go sit down at 10 in the morning. It doesn't work like that. At 3 o'clock's when my mind starts working in the right way. So frequently, it's from 3 to 7, 3 to 8. It's going well. If I'm by myself, I may work till 11 o'clock if it's going. So just not to have expectations of process that I wish would be more convenient.
Right, it is what it is.
Yeah.
How would, this is a question about your style of not having a lot of quotation marks, or all the dialogue in the trackers is not in quotation marks. How did you come to that, and what draws you to that look on the page, or how are we supposed to think about that as readers?
Yeah. Well, a lot of writers do it, and a lot of European writers do it. And Cormac McCarthy, his last few books, he didn't even put the little dashes, It's kind of like you figured out. So I started doing it really on Cold Mountain because quotation marks are just fussy to me, and they're fussy to type. So if some dialogue was going well, I just wrote it, and I knew who was talking, so then I realized, well, it needs a little more help than that, and I started using the dashes. And one thing I realized when I wasn't doing anything is that it was helping me think about how this character talks, so that it's identifiable what's dialogue without necessarily having to have the quotation marks.
It is. Once you are in the book, the trackers, absolutely you know who's speaking, because their voice is that pinpointed. A question from the audience. Now you are a teacher's kid, I believe, right? I'm also a teacher's kid. People talk about preacher's kids, but I'd really like for there to be like the TK, the teacher's kid, because I think that we are unique in our own way. Probably feel that way as a teacher's kid. But what teachers from your past at UNC or in other places really inspired your writing and how you think about your work?
Well, when I was a little kid, my second grade teacher, really this applies to a lot of my teachers, they were all women until I got to the 8th grade. And the second grade teacher is more like the epitome. She was this kind of tall, raw-boned woman, and she expected things out of you. She knew what you could do, and she was the same way with all the kids. She wanted them to live up to their capabilities, and and if you failed her on that, she was really going to make your life in that classroom unhappy until you started doing it. And I liked having those expectations. I liked her pushing me. And then later on, I liked teachers who, well, like professors who didn't look at, it was really fashionable when I was in graduate school for professors to say in reading and talking about a book in class, nothing matters outside of the text. It doesn't matter anything going on in the world at the time, any of that, it's the text itself is it. And I never believed that. It never rang true to me. And I had a professor at University of South Carolina who was a young guy straight out of Edinburgh, and he took the opposite approach. And I took class after class with him. I was his research assistant for a year. And that was really influential in just living up to his expectations of a research assistant was really helpful to me.
Is it difficult for you to end a novel when you are getting towards that point, like to figure out what the ending is, or to know when you've kind of stuck the landing? And then a second question from this is, do you miss these characters when you let them go?
Well, I do a little bit. I mean, when you spend years trying to understand this fictional creation, and trying to understand the logic of the decisions they've already made, and how that leads you to the conclusion. The conclusion of this book, and I'll be careful not to tell too much, but my editor, who was really good and really helpful, but she was so convinced that it was going to end one way that when she got to the end, she just thought I had been a little too oblique about it. And the ending she was expecting was not there. But the more I wrote it, the more I thought, no, this relationship and the way it comes to its conclusion needs to be this way, not the one that started feeling stereotypical to me.
Right. Who do you miss the most from the trackers?
I miss thinking about Eve, about just trying to figure out, okay, what is she doing? Why is she doing it? Is she intentionally trying to confuse these guys? Is she just doing what she wants to do, and they just get confused by it because they expect her to be doing what they expect her to do? I miss those little puzzles every few days, trying to figure out her thinking and motivations, and what her next action would be.
Would you don't write sequels of we get to see what you does next, I imagine?
I've had people over and over say, why didn't you write a sequel to Cold Mountain? And I was like, good. Well, now this, I probably shouldn't tell this story.
Yeah. That's how you know it's going to be a good one.
So the notorious Harvey Weinstein suggested a sequel to Cold Mountain to me. And he got the characters wrong and all that, but he said, okay, you need to do Cold Mountain 2, Ruby's Revenge. And I don't think so.
That conversation hadn't aged well at all. Wow. Oh, that's a story. This is a question that this isn't odd. I want to be clear that the narrator is not the author. Because I'm not questioning you. Have you ever shot a Lamont? pistol?
I have handled an authentic Civil War laments before. I've seen several of them in museums. So I know the heft of them, and they're really, really big, awkward, heavy pistols. I would be hesitant to fire one just because they weren't really very well made. After all that time, I think it's as likely as not to just blow up in your face.
So what if you could give us some reading recommendations or some authors you think we should be paying attention to, who would you like to sort of give some space to?
Oh gosh, well, off the top of my head, one, because we were talking about it before, Wiley Cash. If you haven't read Wiley Cash, he's a really great North Carolina writer. He's just one of the most energetic, engaged writers out there. Annette Samu Clap Salad has a novel out that is am I getting this right? The first novel by a member of the Eastern Band of Cherokee.
Yes, the first novel published by the Eastern Band. There have been poets and short stories, but hers is the first novel.
Yeah, it's called Even As We Read.
Yes, it is beautiful. My students have really loved reading it.
And it's one of my favorite people. A really good writer. So that's on the list. And then I've been obsessed for the past 2 years with this French writer who won the Nobel Prize a couple or 5 or 6 years ago, named Patrick Modiano. And they're little short books, so if you don't like them, you go to too much time. I love them, and they're sort of mysterious. I don't quite know how to articulate what I like about them. But they always have this sense of mystery without an overt, plot, overt mystery to them. It's the main character is just always trying to figure out what's going on around him. His father's in one book is kind of creepy and seems like a criminal, but he doesn't know exactly how. The characters always find themselves. Everybody wanders around Paris smoking cigarettes and thinking. So it may just be an acquired taste.
And when can you give us a preview of the next Charles Frazier novel that we should read? What are you working on now?
I'm working. I don't know what. I'm working on 2 books at the same time. And I had sworn for years and years that I would never write a memoir. And I don't want this book to really be a memoir. But the little town where I grew up was such an unusual little southern Appalachian town. So unstereotypical. I mean, there's so many. I run into so many people over the years that just have this notion of what the southern Appalachians are like. And I have to, when my wife and I got to the University of Colorado, this faculty member, or maybe she was a dean or something, had a dinner for the new people. And I wasn't really one of the new people. I was adjunct. My wife had the real job. But she started talking at the table and said, it's just so remarkable. A young boy from the Appalachian Mountains goes to college
I'm sorry.
Gets a PhD, and I still feel bad about it. I said, my grandparents didn't have indoor plumbing, but they had more books in their house than you do.